Philip, thank you very much. And just so that you don't think I'm completely East Coast, both my parents were born in Glasgow. So I think that gives me proper credentials. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you today about this theme, Graduates for a 21st Century, because one thing that is so exciting about a life in science, engineering, and technology is the ever-increasing pace of change. And I suppose people often say, oh, I don't like change, I don't like things happening. But actually, if nothing's changing, you're in a very bad state indeed. Indeed, you're probably dead if nothing is changing. So certainly most scientists, but I think probably all of us in the room, embrace change. It's exciting, it's rewarding, and it brings along a lot of unexpected pleasures. And I wanted to talk about that change, a changing world, and how our graduates are going to be able to fit in and be capable of contributing to that changing world in the next 30 minutes or so. So in terms of graduates for the 21st century, I think it's useful for us to consider what will the 21st century look like. I know we're in it at the moment, but what's it going to look like as we move forward? And I've just got a presentation that I've pinched from the web. It should have very trendy music with it, but unfortunately time didn't allow to synchronize that this afternoon. So what I'm going to show you is just a few slides that will allow you to challenge what the world looks like. And actually, as I came here and the audio-visual was being set up, it reminded me of my own life when I first started lecturing or giving presentations. And this, of course, was unheard of. And you had acetate sheets, and those were written on. And then when we got really, really trendy, we printed onto the acetate sheets and showed those in overhead projectors. But now you can do a presentation and give it in less than an hour, pulling images from the web and so on. So that's part of our changing world. So apologies to those who've seen this, but shift or change happens. Now, what do I mean by that? So here are just some things to provoke you. So size matters. We live in a global environment. So that if you're 1 in a million in China, that means that there are 1,300 people just like you. There's an awful lot of Chinese people. In India, there are 1,100 people just like you. And if you look at the top population in terms of IQ in China, the top 5% is greater than the whole population of the UK. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that they've got more gifted and talented students than we have students. So it's just, that's a challenging world. So what else? Well, China's soon going to become the #1 English-speaking country in the world. That's interesting. And during the course of this next 30 minutes, then we would expect to see population grow. Only 15 babies born in the UK, 244 in China, 351 in India. Here's an interesting one, that today's learner will have 10 to 14 jobs by the time they're 38. I had 1 by the time I was 38. So the top 10 in-demand jobs in 2010 simply didn't exist 7 or 8 years ago. So we're teaching people today for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that haven't yet been invented, and in order to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. That's the exciting environment. So here's a quiz for you. Name this country. Richest, largest military, center of world business, strongest education, blah, blah, blah. Highest standard of living. What do you think it is? Great Britain. Not now, though. That was in 1900, so haven't things changed? Because that's not where we are now. What about information? So let's look at, for example, our information or data. Just language, let's look at that. There are about 500,000 words in the English language, but in Shakespeare's time, there were 5 times less than that. So our language evolves hugely. Information is amazing. So that a week's worth of the Times newspaper contains more information than any single person was expected to come across in a lifetime in the 18th century. So in terms of information, huge amounts of information generated every year. So next year, we'll generate more than the previous 5,000 years. What does that mean for us? It means for us that shift or change happens, and now you know. So it is important for us to appreciate this, because that is our challenge if we are trying to prepare people to take part in this not just changing world, but a very rapidly changing world. And we don't want our graduates to be threatened by it. We don't want them to be frightened by it. We want them to look at this and think, fantastic, I can really help contribute to this, and I can drive it forward. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about scientific research, because research, in a way, will help drive what happens in the 21st century. And so here's just a little bit. You might think when I put these topics up that these are science fiction, but you'll just have to trust me. Actually, always worry when someone says that. It's easier to not worry because I'm a scientist. If I was another profession, that might be a real worry. But anyway, so where is science going in the 21st century? What sorts of things am I expecting to see in my lifetime? Invisibility. We can already make objects transiently disappear by interfering with wavelength and reception and so on. So the idea of cloaking devices for you Star Trek fans out there, so the Klingon cloaking device, is actually now within our grasp. So we might be able to make things selectively appear and disappear. How amazing. How will that change the world? Miniaturization we already know about, so we have things such as our mobile phones. And there's another thing I remember is seeing somebody using the first mobile phone and thinking, how cool is that? And I don't know what I could have been thinking, because it was this size, and two hands were being held to hold it to the earphone. So a large brick of a battery attached to that mobile phone. Whereas now, our batteries are terribly small, and there's going to be a huge effort to increase the power of battery storage for a whole number of reasons, but also the size and the miniaturization. And I'll come back to another example of that in a minute. Communication is almost instant wherever we are in the world. That makes the world a tiny place. It's very small. I can video conference with people at the other side of the world, and okay, there's a small time delay, but we will be able to cope with that in virtual terms and be able to deal with communications. The type of communication will also be different, and I'm going to give you another example of that in a minute, because it does matter. I could be giving this through a video conference to you now, but socially it matters that we see each other kind of face to face, and that we can pick up nuances. And I don't know how many of you have done this, but video conferences I quite like doing, but only if I've met someone before. And that's because if I've met them before, I have an idea about their characteristics and a bit about their body language, so that I'll understand if somebody, folding their arms is a very obvious one. But I can tell by people's expression, if I've already met them, what's going on at the other end of the video line. If I haven't met someone before, I don't know. So there's an opportunity there around communication a little bit better. Nanomedicine, this is part of the miniaturization. And again, this is on our doorstep. So imagine this, that let's say I have a pain or whatever, so I need to pop a painkiller. Well, imagine me popping the painkiller, and that painkiller being a smart nano pill that, whilst it is absorbed in my gut, sends lots of information back either to my smartphone or back to my doctor's surgery, reporting that actually she might have a pain in her back now, but what she should really be worried about is that furring up of her arteries, so get her in here quick for a quick decoke or debore or whatever you would call it of your arteries. All of that is on the horizon, so that we'll be able to think of medicine in a very preventative way, which is important because we don't have enough money to be able to deliver current medicine in the future, with a growing population, in a standard way. So we have to do it differently, or an awful lot of people will not have access to treatments. So nanomedicine is on the horizon. Smart active materials, that's going to be absolutely the norm, and this is going to bring joy to your hearts. So now you're going to have carpets, wallpapers, bathroom, sanitary equipment, and so on, which is all going to be self-cleaning. You're not going to need to use any water or elbow grease to clean any of these materials, because they'll use UV light and they'll break down the dirt, and you will have a clean, fresh-smelling bath. You won't ever have to scrub it again. Is that just because we're lazy? In my case, yes. I don't like spending time doing that. But also, I don't want to be using, and we do this in Britain, purified water, highly purified drinking water, which, remember, 1/3 of the world's population is already suffering water shortage. I don't want to be using purified drinking water. It takes a lot of energy to purify it in order to clean my bath. I would rather it cleaned itself. So lots of smart materials, same with nano clothing, and I'm delighted to see in the audience Hedda Weitz, and Hedda will know who I'm talking about when I mention this story of a colleague of mine in soil science. And I was talking to him about nanomaterials and the fact that you could use self-cleaning underwear, for example. You could get self-cleaning underwear. And he said, and this is a soil scientist for you, no problem there. I just turn them inside out anyway, and that works for me. However, it wouldn't work for most of us. So what you would want, even with that intimate clothing, is clothing that was clean, fresh smelling. You didn't have to spend time, effort, and more importantly, fresh water to clean items. And that's already on the market. So there are lots of designers such as Eddie Bauer that have self-cleaning shirts. So you can pour a glass of wine on somebody's shirt, just shake it off, shake out the creases, ready to wear the next day. It is the way we will live, and it will be a good way. Trust me. 3D printing. This is a phenomenal technology, and I really can't get over it, but it's here now. So here's an example of 3D printing. At the top, these are small designer tables, printed by a printer in your own home, that lays down materials in layers and delivers to you a three-dimensional object. So here's another example. That coat hook there, printed by 3D printing, you could do it in your own home. So instead of going out to the shops, and there has to be, in my mind, no worse pastime in the world than going shopping, but if you had an internet connection and a 3D printer, you wouldn't even have to wait for delivery, because that's another fault of mine, very impatient. I could just print it out in my own home. Imagine that. That's the 21st century. Transportation may be different. So although I'm not claiming that we could teleport now, we are getting close to thinking how we might change the properties of materials to reduce their mass, to be able to move them using less energy. So there's a possibility there, and I might come back to that one later. And I put this in at the end. This is more a hope. I'm not sure even in the 21st century whether we might be able to address this. But social science is going to change enormously. And if we are living in a changing world with lots of different challenges, we need to think smartly about how we get those messages across. So I could say to you, you must use less energy because there is not enough resource left on the planet, and some of us will die because of it. But actually, a lot of you simply won't change your behavior just because I've given you the evidence. I need to think of a clever way that will work with humans to persuade people to join in on an agenda like that. So there's a lot around the social science that's a real challenge for us. So is all of this going to be delivered by conventional thinking, conventional education that perhaps I was exposed to when I was younger? And I would argue definitely not. I put the Large Hadron Collider up because I wish I had never done life sciences. I wish I'd done high energy physics so I could be a part of this. And I noticed coming into the building lots of pictures of Peter Higgs, who came up with the idea of the Higgs boson. That's now what's being looked at here. Why am I mentioning it? Because what I said earlier about transportation, at the Large Hadron Collider, we're basically trying to understand the fundamental nature of matter, because we don't understand that at the moment. So this bench that I'm standing at, and I'll give it a go, but I can't shift it. That might be because it's bolted to the ground, or it could be because it's just very heavy. But this has mass, and I touch it like this. My hand doesn't go through it. But yet all of us know that this is 99.99% nothing. There's really nothing here. There's a few atoms being held together by forces, and it's giving the bench this amazing property, one of which is this substantial mass. Now, if I could understand what gave it mass, I could alter that, and I could move this very easily when I needed to, using a lot less energy than I do now. So things that seem far removed to application in our world are not. It's a matter of translating that knowledge and making a difference for us globally in the 21st century. So has a shift happened in education then? And we can break down education into just these kind of very broad groups: primary, secondary, further and higher education, and lifelong education. I'm not sure it has changed sufficiently to be able to allow the people coming out of the end of this, and we'd almost hope there was no end to it, hence the lifelong education. What we're hoping for is that we have people who are very embracing and outward looking. And it is a real challenge, because if you remember that shift happens series of slides I gave you at the beginning, what it's indicating to us is that we're educating young people for opportunities that we don't even understand ourselves. So we have to think of generic ways of education so that not just scientists, engineers, and technologists, and I'm in that category, but the artists of this world, the poets of this world, all of the people in our society are able to embrace that changing world, not be fearful of it, and exploit it to their own end for creativity or innovation or whatever. So there's a huge challenge here. So in terms of innovation, what we want in our society as we look towards the 21st century is that we want people to be innovative and creative. So we need to think, what are we doing and what can we do more of in order to support our 21st century learners to be able to deliver this on our behalf. And it requires connectivity across all of those different stages in learning, so primary, secondary school, and going on. It requires people to look forward as well as back. So one of the things, certainly from personal experience, thinking of my own education, is I went to primary school and then secondary school and then university and onwards. I never looked backwards, and I didn't ever go backwards. It never occurred to me in secondary school to go back to primary school and tell people in primary school what I was doing and how exciting it was and what was in store for them, or trying to inspire them in any way. And I think that's something we could usefully do in the 21st century, because one of the things that I notice, and I just have to be realistic about this, is that, so here's an interesting social science thing. If I go into a primary school and the kids come up to me and ask, who am I, what do I do? And if I say I'm a scientist, they're just absolutely fascinated by that, and they're trying to touch the hem of my gown and, oh, it's a scientist. They absolutely cannot get enough of me. And if I go into a secondary school, what are you? I'm a scientist. Yawn, yawn, yawn. Now, it's not that they're not interested in science, but it's partly because of what I look like in terms of what influences young people. In other words, when the hormones kick in, I think you'll find that image is terribly important. So if you had graduates at a university or undergraduates or postgraduates at university going into secondary school saying the coolest thing you could do with your life is science, then they would pay attention. Because when I go in, who they see telling them that science is cool is someone that looks just like their mother, or on a bad day, their grandmother. So I think that we need to be aware of that, and I think, can we be more imaginative about how we get people at every stage of learning to think about taking detours, looking backwards as well as forwards, and be a bit more joined up? I think there's huge potential there. Similarly, an awful lot of people at secondary school don't necessarily think university's for them, or think that further education isn't for them, that they want to go to university, not a college. And I think we have a big barrier to break down there, because what would be wonderful is if you could dip in and out, if our courses across further and higher education were compatible enough to allow me, for example, to go and start studying in a further education college and realize that I'm a bit more theoretically orientated and I need to go to university and continue my studies. But often at university courses, people start studying and they want something a bit more practical and applied, and they could be moved backwards or sideways into further education. So I think that we've got a lot of opportunity there to think about how we deliver education. Second bullet point, what do we want a graduate to look like? Whether they're a graduate of science, engineering, technology, or another subject, I think we need them to be very connected to the rest of the world, and actually experience suggests they're a lot better at connectivity than someone of my age would be. But be very connected, and not just to people in Scotland. We want them to be connected to people in Korea and Japan, and to be able to communicate with people all around the world. We want them to be resilient, because their world is not going to stand still. So we don't want them to look at change as a threat. We want them to really embrace it and think, fantastic, what a good opportunity. They need to be flexible. So they need to think about doing those different jobs. It's sort of scary to think that by the time you're 38, you might have 10 to 14 different jobs. But in another way, that's quite exciting, because each job you do will bring you different set of experiences, new people to meet, different environment to become familiar with. So a real opportunity. We need imagination, absolutely. So our education must not be fact-based. It must be conceptually based, so that people are always exploring boundaries. And the next point, multidisciplinary. You can't deliver self-cleaning underpants just by being a chemist. You need to be a biologist, a material scientist, a bit of a social scientist as well, possibly. You need to be many things. And if you don't want to expand your own experience, you need to know how to make friends with one of those other scientists or technologists who can speak your language and who can deliver what you want. And lastly, you really need to be international, because the joy of science and engineering, I think most certainly is that you can be the best in the world and you can speak to the best in the world. That's your calling card. So many of us think we're in Scotland. It's a very small nation, only 5 million people. But for those of you who've not heard this statistic before, this will probably surprise you. But relative to our GDP, the impact of research in Scotland is number 1 in the world. Okay, we're number 1 in the world. We're way ahead of the rest of the UK, the US, Japan, Germany, France, all the research-intensive economies. We are number 1. So the volume of what we do is necessarily small, because we're only 5 million. The impact is unbeatable. So what are we number 1 in the world at? Again, this is going to surprise you. Never mind GDP. What are we just number 1 at? Space science. Okay? Again, volume very small. What we produce, everyone in the world pays attention to. Pharmacology, number 1 in the world. agricultural science, #1 in the world. It's just utterly amazing, and I could go on. But that's where we are, and that excellence is what we underpin our graduates with. But we need to be able to be sure we also give them those additional graduate skills, and for me, I've mentioned some of them. It's not an exhaustive list. And that's what we must match it up with. Because if we've got somebody who's not outward looking, who isn't connected, who isn't prepared to work with others, who's not really imaginative, somebody who doesn't like boundaries, those are the sorts of people that we want to produce, because they will change the world that we live in. And actually, some of you might have read a book by an American author called Arthur Herman. And Arthur Herman wrote a book that all we Scots love, because it's called How Scotland Invented the Modern World. And he wrote that about Scotland's impact on the world during the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So we used our science, our engineering, our technology, and our philosophy to change the way the world thinks. We're an absolute hotbed. But do you know, nothing has changed. So at the moment, we're inventing the future in Scotland with the quality of our research. So we mustn't lose the opportunity to match that up with the quality of our graduates, so that we can be not just world beaters, because that sounds kind of aggressive, but we need our place in the world. We need to be able to compete, and we need to contribute to solving global problems, and that we can do here in Scotland. So just some other technologies that I thought I would mention that we're doing now. So this is what our graduates are engaging in. So assisted living. Did you know that by 2031 in Scotland, every school leaver will have to be a carer because of our aging population? Horrible thought, isn't it, for the school leavers? Because it's me they're going to have to look after in 2031, and I'm going to make sure I'm difficult to look after, I think. I'm not going to be an easy recipient of care. So what can we do about the infirm, the elderly, to keep people in their homes safer, happier, more active for longer? Well, assisted living, we can use a technology in that way. And there are numbers of ways we can do that. This is Cisco technology. These are 3 real people. This is the 4th person that's joined them. And that person is just an image, an electronically created hologram who's at the meeting. Here's a young woman here, and this is the hologram of her face that's being projected at the time. And, okay, some films we already know about, but just imagine this. So instead of me being mean and unhelpful to the young school leaver who's coming in to look after me, instead my life's going to be full of inviting my mates around to my house for coffee, but in virtual form. And instead of inviting some of my male friends around and have them look just like they do in real life, I'll have them look like Johnny Depp. That's who'll be joining me for my coffee. So, do you know, I'm going to have an exciting and interesting older life, and that's going to be delivered by technology, and it's going to be delivered because of the imagination of our graduates, who are going to be able to use that technology to do unimaginable things at the moment. Okay, so these are other examples of, in this case, smartphone applications. And I just thought I'd put them up because, okay, these are all medical applications, so real-time monitoring on an iPad of some vital signs. Here, this is a teaching tool for anatomy, being able to dissect through the body. And again, here looking at musculature, so you can lift up and pare away musculature, look at the nerves that innervate that. So a very good way for our graduates to learn. So we can use technology to support our graduates, as well as just challenging our graduates always to be different. We can teach them in different ways. And why I'm mentioning these smartphone applications in particular, because at the University of Aberdeen, where I still have my research lab, one of the interesting things that we're doing with our computing science students, and this I'm sure is true of other universities, is that we're challenging them in their honours project to go out and find a local business and to ask them, would they find apps useful to be able to interact with their customers. And then they design apps for their customers, and they give them then to the company, and that's the completion of their honours project. So a real piece of applied interactive behaviour. And in a number of cases, what that's resulted in is the company saying, would you like to earn a little bit of extra money at the weekends and in the evenings by working with me? Or why don't you come to work with me afterwards and develop more stuff because my sales have gone up because of what you've done for me? So we can think about giving our graduates real opportunities during their training period with us to be able to interact with the work environment instead of having a sort of a gap or a barrier between work and your education. That shouldn't be there. They should be mixed up as well as that primary, secondary, further and higher education. The commercial or the work environment needs to be woven in through that all the way through. And here's the last thing. Many of you are involved in teaching people, graduates. So do you think those graduates that you teach think of themselves as an employee of the future? Or do they think of themselves, instead of an employee, an employer? Okay, what do they think of themselves? What do you think of them? Are you creating employees or employers? And I've shamelessly pinched this from Professor Ian Underwood, who's here at the University of Edinburgh, who challenged a number of people along these lines. Because I think we possibly don't think about it at all. But when I challenge undergraduates about what do you think of yourself, they almost all say, I'm going to be an employee. They don't think of, actually, you know, I could set up a business, I could do this, I could be on my own or whatever. That requires us giving them or supporting them with the tools that gives them the confidence to think about all possibilities in life, not just the usual. And finally, I just wanted to mention this because one of the most creative things you can do with your life is to do science, in my view. It stacks up right up there with music, with theatre, with art, with poetry, with literature. Science is an incredibly creative thing. It's part of our culture. Always has been, and it always will be in Scotland. It's a fundamental part of our culture. It's fun, it's stimulating and exciting. That's why we have 4 science centres in Scotland, which are publicly funded. You don't find that anywhere else, certainly not in the rest of the UK. And that's because we want people to think of possibilities. So we want them to think of, what's a crazy idea? What would you really like? So imagine having a belt that you could put on that would allow you to break dance in a very spectacular way. Come on, you must all have wanted that at some point in your life. And again, a guitar that tunes itself, never goes out of tune. Clothing that changes colour depending on either the temperature or the environment. That's actually with us. So there's all sorts of things we could do. We need to give our graduates the tools to allow them to think outside the box and to deliver that. Thank you very much.